We love huge, immersive worlds, but you gotta have a little danger in there, otherwise it's not particularly interesting, is it? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 open world games with the most dangerous worlds. Starting off at number 10, it's Days Gone. What makes this game more dangerous than some other open world games out there is the survival element. It's not just that getting around can be dangerous because all the zombies, it's that you've also got to be prepared. The main thing you really have to maintain is your bike, which takes damage, it can run out of fuel if you're not careful, and if you run out of gas, you'll pretty much be stranded. And that is not fun, so keeping your bike gassed up and repaired is absolutely essential because everything wants to kill you. There's your standard bandits, there's zombies, they're called freakers in this game, but you'll also have to deal with wolves, crows, and of course the marquee feature, not some random zombie out on its own, but the hordes of them that infest certain sections of this map. The hordes are basically the boss fights. There are so many of them that whittling them down requires a strategy and a lot of resources, which, of course, it being a zombie apocalypse game, are in short supply. It's not the absolute hardest game out there, but they do a really good job making the world feel dangerous. And playing somewhat cautiously is almost required at first because there's a whole lot of stuff that just wants you dead. At number 9 is Valheim, a hot new thing in the world of survival games, and it's easy to see why. It's got a really distinct style, it's generally pretty user-friendly compared to other games in the genre, and it's just fun to play. Oh yeah, and you can't die from hunger. But while it makes things easier in some ways, it gets downright brutal in others. Enemies will mess you up right from the start. A simple boar can take you down in a few hits, so it's absolutely essential you go into any fight prepared. In order to progress through the game, you have to take on some nasty bosses, so learning the combat system is essential to survival. There's plenty of stuff that wants to kill you wandering the world, and the penalty for death can be especially rough for players just starting out. It's a game that forces you to play somewhat cautiously at first. Death can hit you fast, and there's a lot of stuff that wants you dead. It's not the most brutal survival game out there, but it's no cakewalk and definitely earns a spot on this list. At number 8, it's Dying Light. It's a zombie apocalypse, so no surprise here that the world is dangerous. The whole point of the game is that you've got to parkour around swarms of zombies rather than kill them because they just keep coming. And even though one zombie by itself isn't all that dangerous, add in a few more along with some of the nastier variants and you'll quickly find yourself in trouble. The game is dangerous during the day, but it's downright lethal at night. That's when the real danger of this world comes out, the volatiles. These things are hyper-aggressive and relentless, trying to fight them at close range will probably just lead you to disaster, so you're pretty much forced to avoid them. They've got pretty narrow vision cones, but if you're close, they approach you non-stop, so trying to sneak around them can be a nerve-wracking experience. Night in Haran, the city the game takes place in, is just the worst. Most of the city's almost pitch black, and while you can equip a flashlight and the volatiles don't react to it, it can still be pretty confusing to try to get around the sometimes maze-like streets. And while night is bad, there's still some pretty dangerous stuff out during the day. Boss monsters wander around, there are bandits who will ambush you, and basically the whole city is one big death trap. Once you get enough skill under your belt, you'll be able to deal with a lot of this stuff, and way easier than at the beginning of the game, but it doesn't stop it from feeling dangerous, even when you're a total zombie-killing badass by the end. At number 7 is Far Cry 2. Unlike most of the other games on this list, Far Cry 2 doesn't have any monsters or zombies or even any survival mechanics. The danger of this world is more mundane, but it's all still incredibly dangerous. Set in an unnamed African country in the middle of a civil war, you play as a mercenary who rolls in to find this arms dealer named the Jackal. To let you know what kind of game this is, you immediately fail and then get malaria. That's the first danger of this game, malaria. Unless you manage to get some medicine, it'll eventually knock you out and just force you back to the clinic. The other danger is, of course, the enemies. Soldiers from both sides basically want you dead at all times, and they do not quit. One of the biggest complaints people had about the game were the constantly respawning checkpoints, and yeah, they are pretty bad. Basically, if you want to go anywhere in this game, you have to drive by a few enemy checkpoints, which without fail will refill with enemies even if you just cleared them out. Later Far Cry games made it so clearing outposts removed the enemy presence, but not here. And unless you manage to buy your own weapons, enemy weapons are total junk. These things are prone to jamming at the worst possible moment, and even though it's a cool detail, it's super annoying in the middle of a firefight. So enemies constantly attack you, your guns can be total junk, and oh yeah, you got a life-threatening disease. Yeah, I'd call that dangerous. And number 6 is Subnautica, basically an open world survival game where one of the biggest dangers is the environment itself. The planet you're stranded on is basically just one big ocean, so anything, literally anything, requires you to dive underwater. That means you're basically always in danger of running out of air, and while you can do things like increase your oxygen tanks or use vehicles that generate their own oxygen, there is always that danger of drowning. So that's pretty bad, but there's also nastier horrors hiding in the depths. A lot of the surface sea life doesn't really mind you, or kind of annoying at worst, but the deeper you go, the farther out you explore, the nastier stuff you will find. Some of this stuff can really mess you up, and unlike some of the other games we're talking about here, there's usually very little you can do about it. It's not really a combat game, and while you do get a few offensive options, they're not that great, so it's usually better to just run and hide when some of these deep sea monstrosities come after you. So that's 2 incredibly dangerous things in the game: the sea life itself and the omnipresent fear of drowning. So while a lot of this game can be almost relaxing when you're just hanging out in the coral reefs near the surface, things get a lot more tense the further out you go. And number 5 is Dragon's Dogma, basically a cross between Skyrim and Monster Hunter. Dragon's Dogma was this game that was almost ahead of its time in a lot of ways. The big focus is taking down these gigantic monsters, but there's plenty of standard human-sized creatures out there as well, and they can be relentless. Going anywhere in the open world game can be rough. You get constantly ambushed by wolves, bandits, harpies, skeletons. Basically, if it's a fantasy staple, it's probably out there and it wants you dead. Of course, there's giant monsters wandering around too, and they're just as aggressive as everything else. The world itself isn't all that big compared to other open worlds out there, but it's dense with enemies. I mean, can you even imagine trying to live in this world? Every 2 steps you take, you're being swarmed by packs of wolves and wizards and lizard men. This isn't a ruined kingdom like Dark Souls, where basically everyone's dead or turned into a monster. There is supposed to be a working kingdom here, but it's gotta be hellish to live in for everybody who's not a monster of some kind. The combat is awesome though, and if you're tough enough, you can steamroll everything this game throws at you, but for the most part, it's a real ordeal just going from point A to point B. At number 4 is The Forest, another open world survival game with an interesting twist to the formula. Instead of exploring a fantasy world or something like that, you crash land on this island and you're looking for your lost son there. The game's interesting because it doesn't really play its hand right away, it slowly builds things up. First, you'll most likely start spotting these creepy tribal looking dudes watching you from far away or hanging out in villages. Eventually they start trying to kill you, and unless you're prepared, it's not going to go that well for you. Dealing with these guys is bad enough, but it only gets worse when you start exploring the caves dotted around the island. These things are claustrophobic horror shows filled with bizarre mutated enemies. Going in with just a lighter and a survival axe is definitely not recommended, as you're probably seeing now. It didn't go so well for us. The island of the forest is just an incredibly dangerous place. It's possible to start the game off and play it for hours without realizing it though. The cannibals tend to leave you alone until you build up a lot. But once they do start coming after you, you need to be ready because they can be relentless. And number 3 is Stalker Call of Pripyat. Out of all the Stalker games that have been released so far, people consider Call of Pripyat to be the best, and a big reason for that's the open world you explore. Every other game in this series has been dangerous for a variety of reasons, but this one has the most treacherous world. There's the usual dangers of mutants and bandits, both of which can kill you in seconds if you're not careful, but what really makes this section of the zone tough are the anomalies. These things can be tough to detect, difficult to navigate, and if you run into one, incredibly damaging. And they're everywhere. Seems like every major location you run into will have some kind of anomaly going on, and usually it's not something you're going to want to mess with. Of course, some of the best treasures are found where these anomalies happen, so if you're prepared to take some damage and absorb a lot of radiation, there are benefits to checking these spots out. Just quick save a lot because death is around every corner. None of the Stalker games are easy. In fact, Call of Pripyat is probably the easiest out of the original game and its expansions, but the actual open world it takes place in is arguably the most dangerous of them all, at least when it comes to all the anomalies. At number 2 is Outward. This unique RPG/survival game never really gives you an easy break. The premise is about as basic as it gets. You owe the town some money, so you gotta go out and earn some. And for most games, leaving the starting town is not a big deal. But here, you really have to be ready before you step outside because this wilderness will mess you up. Outside of some of the nastier survival elements, like the fact that your max stamina will lower until you manage to sleep in a real bed, it's just a really dangerous world. Simple bandits and wolves can ruin your day pretty easily, might I add, and to add insult to injury, you don't even respawn back in town or load a save or anything. You just get dragged back to the wolf cave or bandit camp. So now the game forces you to retrieve your stuff and sneak out, probably in the middle of the night when it's pitch black, and when you get out, you're most likely in a place you've never seen before, so now you're completely lost. It's pretty easy to get stuck in a death spiral at this point. Basically, especially at the start of the game, you have to pick your battles. Sometimes when you get killed, you get lucky and rescued by someone who leaves you somewhere close to where you died and gives you a few items to help you out, but more likely you'll get thrown into a mine and forced into slave labor. So survival is tough, death is often worse than just, dying and restarting, and the world is massive and filled with dangers. If you think most action RPGs out there are too easy and you really want to test yourself, give Outward a try, because this game does not let up. At number 1 is Kenshi, probably the strangest game on this list. Kenshi is this totally crazy RPG slash survival game slash RTS kind of hybrid. It's a game with a lot going on, and it does very little to tutorialize you and just throws you out to the wolves. This is a game where you can play a scenario called Rock Bottom, where you start out as a naked guy missing a limb in the middle of the desert. Unsurprisingly, we managed to wander around for a few minutes before getting gored by a giant bug. But that's making the game intentionally hard. Even if you pick the easier scenarios, you can get totally wrecked by the unforgiving world this takes place in. Groups of enemies don't come in like 2 or 3. If you run into bandits, you pretty much have to do what they say, because these dudes come rolling in with like 10 or more dudes. It is hilariously one-sided if you actually try to fight them at the start. Eventually you can build up a posse and even start your own town, but getting there, not gonna be easy, especially if you get knocked out and then the enemy decides to just carry you around with him forever, because that happens. That's all for today. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable all notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter, Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.